Welcome, everybody. My name is David Kramer. I'm director of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it has been our pleasure over the course of many years to either sponsor or co-sponsor book-related programs of interest to the larger Jewish community and beyond. And this is certainly one of those programs. I have to say to my friend and colleague, Rabbi Professor Bert Visotsky, that we have cooperated on a number of programs, and it's really been a pleasure for me. I hope it has for you as well. And folks, we are so glad you are here. Those of you who are in the room and those of you who have just signed on from the introductory panel know that we are here for a discussion, an interview with the authors of It Takes Two to Torah by Abigail Pogrebin and Rabbi Dov Linzer. Rabbi Linzer is the Rosh HaYeshiva of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, YCT, a very important institution for the training of observant rabbis in this country. It has a very particular and very, very important niche, and we're grateful to you for being here, for being part of the book, and for the work you do at YCT, because it is really, really important. So we're appreciative of this. And Abby is a journalist, a writer, a convener of discussions, an organizer, all the good things that we need in order to have healthy discussions and to find ourselves challenged. And so my friend and colleague, Rabbi Bert Visotsky, is going to conduct the interview tonight, and we thank you for being here. There will be occasion for questions come the end. Okay?
Thank you.
Bert.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. It is always a pleasure to work with Professor Kramer, who not only runs the library, he's very modest, he writes many important books, both hardcore scholarship and popular. So if you want to learn about the Babylonian Talmud, the mind of the Talmud, David Kramer is the guy to go to. I'm Bert Visotsky. I am the Appelman Professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies Emeritus. That's my favorite word these days. And I also direct the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue here at JTS. And it feels a little bit like interreligious dialogue because we have an Orthodox rabbi and a Reform journalist in conversation. And this, I want to say first and foremost that I always do my homework. I'm a good boy. Still trying to please mom all these years later. But this book is utterly fascinating. I have read the Torah before from cover to cover, and I've studied pretty much all the Midrashim on the Torah and the Church Fathers, etc. And almost on every page I learned something new here. And I learned something new for a very simple reason, because Abby and Dov are not afraid to ask questions. And as I was saying to Dov, there's really a narrative arc to the book, because the book begins kind of didactically with Dov instructing Abby. And Abby, as is her wont, eventually takes over. And she, through her really incisive questions, winds up instructing Dov as well. And the learning that goes on is just wonderful. It's open to beginners, and I will say, as someone who is not a beginner, it's also open to people who really know a lot. But I do want to ask, and it's still a bit of a mystery to me, how did this come about that the two of you decided to study together? I think it didn't start as a book. It started as a study or a podcast.
Yeah.
How'd you do that? Where'd that come from?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, if I may call you Bert, since I've practically grown up with you. And just full disclosure, Bert is a great friend of the family, of my parents, and my late father and my living mother. And I was lucky enough to study Genesis with Bert for, I think, 6 years, which is amazing. A group in my house, in my living room, which was amazing. We had great wine and great Torah. We met at a Jewish conference, which is not so exciting an answer, except that it was kind of an unusual friendship. I mean, in the sense that it wasn't like we all of a sudden started having lunch together. The conference was called The Conversation. Some of you may remember it, remember the Jewish Week. Not remember it, it still exists, but sadly not in its robust form. They convened every 2 years or so a group of people who would come, like 35 to 40, in Baltimore, and they basically selected Jewish professionals kind of across the gamut in terms of ideology and expertise. So there were clergy, there were journalists, there were not-for-profit heads. And Dov and I were tossed there together and kind of ended up in the same breakout sessions. It was open technology. I don't know if any of you ever used that. It wasn't like there was a program. It was all kind of generated by whatever was on our minds. And you would go to the sessions that were created that spoke to where you were struggling. And not only did we end up in the same rooms, but I'm a little bit, as you know, of like a rabbi groupie. Like if somebody is suddenly making me think differently, I kind of make a mental note. And part of it is because in my journalism, I end up calling a lot of rabbis because that's kind of where not my expertise, but my investigation has landed. After years of as a generalist at 60 Minutes, and I worked for Bill Moyers and Charlie Rose, who I'm not supposed to admit I worked for anymore, and have ended up focusing on just the Jewish landscape. It's just fascinated me. And as you know, Bert, when I became a late bat mitzvah at age 40, and we can not do the math on that, I ended up actually auditing Bert's class. It was Judaism and Christianity, the first 5 centuries.
I had forgotten all about that.
Yeah. I have it on tape. You allowed me to record it on an actual cassette recorder. That's how old it was. But I became...
Susie, you can see me later to be the agent for that.
Yes. Right, we should have rights. But it's a long way of saying that I turned back to Dov when I was working on something, and he was often the person I consulted. And when I did my second book, which was taking a deep dive into the entire Jewish calendar, really understanding what I'm sure many of you live without thinking, why does Shmini Atzeret exist in 2014? Why, where did it come from? What are the rituals? Why does it still matter? And I did that for 18 holidays, and Dov was really my fact checker at the end, not really. And in the fact checking, it was like he kicked the tires on every Jewish assertion in the book, and that became its own chavruta. And likewise, when he was writing an op-ed for the Times, he called me because that was not necessarily familiar territory for him. He did actually get in the New York Times, which is something I haven't managed. And my sister writes for the Times. Some of you may know, she's my twin, and I'm always complimented on her articles, and I just say thank you. But anyway, we had that kind of chavruta, and it was finally, it's a long Jewish way of saying, it was Dov who said, these conversations that we have, it would be, there's something about, there's sort of a friction, if that's the word, that's happening in the fact that we come at this stuff so differently, and that when we're talking about even something like a minutiae, like I remember I was asking about the feather in the preparation for Passover. You're supposed to take this feather and clean the cabinets of every crumb. And I said, where's the feather thing? Where does that come from? And then we have like 2 days of back and forth, and he's, looking up all these commentaries and these things, and then I'm saying, but that doesn't make sense with this. And he was, I think that his reaction was, this is what doesn't happen enough, is that we're just kind of in a conversation about a text that has been alive for all of these centuries, and we should do a podcast, and I'll turn it over to him.
Just before you jump in, Dov, and I'm definitely going to ask you the same question, because I'll bet you'll have a different version of the answer. Abby, you mentioned, I think one, but you had 2 books before this on Jewish topics. So the first one, I think, was called Stars of David.
Yes, thank you, Don.
And then the second one, I remember after the colon was...
It's My Jewish Year.
My Jewish Year.
18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew.
Yes. I read both of those books, and I had the same comment to Abby both times, which was, I've spent 50 years as a professor of Jewish studies. And in those 2 books, she will reach more Jews with better explanations than I have in my entire career. So I'm jealous, but in awe of your capability. Dov,
Yes.
you not only have this book, I think you're about to bring out a book of responsa.
That is true. Wow, you've done your homework. So for about, I wear two hats. One is the president of Chovevei Torah, an Orthodox rabbinical school that promotes a more open, inclusive orthodoxy. And I've been the Rosh HaYeshiva of that rabbinical school since its inception, which was 25 years ago, which is like the scholarly rabbinic head. And starting 5 years ago is when I became the president. And so actually, this book, I would say, was probably, or the podcast, was probably prompted by, to some degree, by my move from Rosh HaYeshiva to president. Because, you know, one of the things that I pride ourselves in terms of our rabbinical school is that we believe in an orthodoxy that's invested in not building walls, but building bridges, in sending our rabbis out there to serve broader Am Yisrael, and to translate, you know, the ancient wisdom to the realities of today and to our human lives. And so much of what they are able to do so brilliantly is to make the Torah alive and relevant. But even though those were the rabbis that we were training, and that's the work they did out in the field, for 20 years, I was not talking to the broader Jewish people. I was just teaching these rabbinical students. And when I moved from being just the Rosh HaYeshiva to also being the president, I realized I had to be in conversation with, you know, with the Jewish people at large. And I had to bring the Torah outside of the walls of the Beit Midrash and into people's lives, into the world. And I think that probably is a little bit of what prompted me to say to Abby, we've been having these amazing, rich conversations. Wouldn't it be great if we could bring it out there? The other book that you mentioned is more with my Rosh HaYeshiva hat on. For the last 10 years or so, we've been having a WhatsApp group, which is where our rabbis in the field, and it's also the graduates of Maharat, which is the Orthodox rabbinical school that trains women rabbis, which began 12 years ago, which was a major innovation for Orthodoxy when that began. So the rabbis in the field from Chovevei and from Maharat are on this WhatsApp where they ask me questions that they are getting out there in their congregations that are sort of above their pay grade. And, you know, and they ask rather than picking up the phone, which they sometimes do by asking on this WhatsApp. It's a forum where I can give an answer and we can all continue learning Torah together. We're all learning from those questions and from the way, you know, the answers and so on. So what we're about to do, I hope I'll be sending it to the publisher in the next month or two, so maybe it'll be coming out in about 6 to 9 months, will be a collection of those answers that I've given to rabbis in the field, particularly around life cycle issues, and I would say a major theme, which is a lot of what, you know, a lot of the ethos of our institution is both a real responsiveness to complicated, sensitive issues that can come up around life cycle issues, and also really questions a lot about women's roles within those rituals.
And this book is going to be in English.
This will be in English, yes.
Oh, great, great. I do want to comment one thing. My daughter-in-law, Katie, is a podcast producer, and she has taught me that when she is seeing what's out there in the field, she has learned to listen to podcasts at 1.5 or double speed. And she said, and if you listen carefully, you can do it. But I just want to comment, the two of you, each New Yorkers that you are, speak so quickly that when you listen to their podcast, listen to it at half speed, and it'll come out just fine. You'll be able to hear everything they have to say. But we are getting double the content,
right,
which is very important. So I was thinking about how to approach the 54 portions in this book. And Abby, you can see it. I usually hate doing this dog-earing.
Wow.
But as I was reading, I was dog-earing pages to say, I want to ask them about this, and I want to ask them about this. And then I realized virtually every page is dog-eared. Oh. So that at a certain point is not very helpful.
Do you want me to help?
So maybe.
Yeah.
So here's the first thing. One of the things they do, and it's a little bit like cheating, is they summarize each week's Torah reading. And then they pick one thing in that Torah reading to zero in on. So I was thinking, how do I find samples? And it dawned on me, like, why should I be worrying about it? We read the Torah last week. We're going to read the Torah this coming week. So I asked that we are going to do stuff from last week's portion and this week's portion. So last week's portion was YCT, right? Okay. So This is fearful. I used to be able to bobby pin my yarmulke on. Now I need a thumbtack. It's like
I think Velcro on the inside.
Velcro, okay. I'm just going to read your summary with your permission. Fearful of Esau's murderous rage after Jacob stole his blessing, Rebekah, their mother, tells Jacob to flee the land of Canaan and to go to his uncle Laban's house in Haran until Esau's anger subsides. Isaac also charges him to go to Laban's land to choose a wife from one of Laban's daughters. At one point during his journey, Jacob lies down to sleep and dreams of a ladder extending above his head toward the heaven. The angels ascend and descend the ladder, and God appears to Jacob and promises to protect him, assuring that he and his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan. So, in 1989, I looked it up, I was discussing this with the study group that your mom first joined before you ever joined it. I had a group of writers, and we would read through Genesis. And because it was a group of writers, a reporter from the New York Times came, and she asked me, give me an example of what you guys study. So it happened to be that week's portion. So I said, we just in the writers group, we read this story about Jacob, and he lies down and he has this dream of this ladder extending all the way to heaven, and God promises him seed as plentiful as will fill the earth. And the reporter said to me I didn't realize she was baiting me. She said, so what do you think that ladder means? And I, like a fool, not focusing on the fact that I was actually speaking to a reporter, said, well, how about if we offer a Freudian interpretation? Isn't that ladder a lovely phallic symbol? And as soon as the words came out of my mouth, I realized this reporter now has her quote from Vysotsky. And sure enough, it wound up in the New York Times. So, by way of caution, be careful what you say. But take us a little bit on the story of Jacob fleeing his brother's wrath. By the way, Jacob and Esau, twins. So, Abby, you may have a certain insight about the murderous rage that twins have for one another. But why don't you guys go at it for a while?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that comes to my mind, if you're asking specifically about the ladder, is the sense that he is finding himself alone and without support and without family. And I think the sense that not only God stands over the ladder and says, I will be with you, I will bring you back, but the sense that there are these hosts, there are so many other divine beings there that are there to protect him. I think one of the stories about Jacob is that loneliness and his need for self-sufficiency and running from his home. So to me, that's at least something that idea of the ladder evokes. A classic interpretation is also that this was somehow symbolic of the different exiles that the Jewish people would suffer. That's a completely rabbinic interpretation. I don't think that you get a hint for that. But again, what it sort of points to is Jacob as the character who's in exile, the character, the Jew. He sort of represents the Jew in exile, the Jew who is beset with travails, with suffering, with challenges, and therefore the message that God says, I am going to be with you, I will bring you back to the land, like what God says to Moses, I will be who I will be with you in this difficult time. To me, that's a lot of what that whole dream is about.
This is not a physical exile, because he's still in the land.
Right.
It's a spiritual exile.
Well, he's about to leave, and he's going to be away for 22 years, He's running away from his homeland. He's going to relatives, but not having any, having to fend for himself and having to deal with all of those challenges.
What's the traditional read of the angels going up and down?
So in this read, that they represent the different countries that we are going to be exiled to as a people. It's that he sees those countries, those nations in ascendancy, and then he sees eventually they'll fall down and the Jewish people will survive. The Midrash is actually quite poignant because the Midrash says that when it comes to Rome, each one of them, the Babylonians ruled over us for 70 years, and this nation for this long. And with the Romans, it says he sees them going up and up and up, and he never sees them coming down. And he's afraid, how long will this exile last?
Can I just ask what you think about those angels going up and down? How do you teach that?
I'm the interviewer.
Okay.
What do you think about those angels coming up and down, Ab?
I don't, I don't know about sort of the angel traffic. What I think that is interesting, and I was talking to Dov recently about just the fact that this is a dream, and then the next one actually happens, in the next parsha. And is there any? It feels like they're both dreamlike. The wrestling is the thing that happens next, when obviously is it his hip?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically when I have to remember at what point, is he crossing over at that point when he's?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's still escaping Esau.
Right. He's about to encounter Esau.
And
right.
and then he wrestles with an angel, and it's supposed to be God. I mean, it's assumed to be God. But his socket is pulled out,
Yeah.
right? And so my point is that both feel like questionably true events, and maybe I shouldn't be pairing them, but it feels like this is all part of what it means to be without your twin. I don't see it just family. I think it's a big deal to suddenly be alone, and I'm also seeing, and I think one of the things you taught me is the evolution of these characters. They're growing up, in a sense, and that this is part of his maturation.
I very much like that, and when we look at what we're about to read this coming week, I'm going to press you on that. You said that Jacob wrestles with an angel. Yeah?
Am I wrong about that?
Well, I don't know. I don't think the text actually ever mentions an angel. It says that Jacob wrestled with a man.
A man.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we all assume it was an angel.
Right.
And, yes, the Midrash puts that seed in our mind. But I don't know why we can't credit the fact that, maybe somebody was trying to mug him at night. I mean, it's certainly not an elegant way to tell the story. It's much more romantic, because the angel blesses him.
Right.
But, we give
But
each
he
other...
blesses him because he asks him to. No?
Right, but don't we all bless one another? Don't you ask for blessing? I mean, my Hebrew name is Baruch, and so I always sign my letters blessings, because I would say bivracha, so it's a pun on my name. Mm-hmm. But I've come to appreciate that receiving and giving blessings is not a small thing. And it's almost like a quantum. So come back to the story. I mean, and especially, I really want to press you on
The twin thing.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you and Robin still have very good relations.
Yeah, no, I have to say, and this is something I felt when I was doing my twins book, which is the book that people leave out because nobody read it, and it wasn't Jewish, so that's what happens when you write a non-Jewish book. You read it, Bert. Thank you. I feel very seen. I wrote a book about twins from soup to nuts, like everything from the psychology to the genetics to all of the fact that they are the perfect petri dish to test every trait and development. But I also have a chapter on twins in the Bible. And I just remember I was interviewing Rabbi David Wolpe for this, with all due respect, and it was I just refused to believe that it was an accurate representation of twinship. Or, and we'll get to Rachel and Leah, I feel like that's also way oversimplified and frankly stereotypical, if there could have been such a thing in the Bible. It's reductive in a way that doesn't ring true to me. And it's not just that I'm very close to my sister. When I was studying twins for the book, identical twins have a protectiveness that And actually, it's when, and I remember talking to you about the moment of the kiss, that instead of when they meet, they actually kiss. And I think there's a bite. Isn't there something that happens in the text itself where there's some kind of demarcation that suggests
When it says he kissed him?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's little dots over
Little
there.
There's
dots.
a dot over the word.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in a way, it proves my point that I feel like ultimately the bottom line on twinship is protectiveness and a sense that like you are me, so I'm not going to come for you in the same way. And without getting to my like therapy, that's the way it has been with me and Robin, is that whatever conflict we have, we're sort of wearing each other's pain and joy, and we don't go at loggerheads to the point where it would be a zero-sum game. And that's why it felt, the fact that he was so scared of Esau and running in a sense for his life and planning like, half of you go here and half of you go there, that just felt, again, I know we're talking about a very different landscape, but like it wasn't true to the relationship. Something fundamental and primal was missing there.
So you're seeing the dots over that word he kissed him as like an underline, like to emphasize that there was real love there.
Or actually something happening in that moment that is different from other moments.
Right. It's interesting because there's actually a Yiddish saying called Vayishakehu mit pintalach, which means he kissed him with dots, because the word is, and he kissed him, and it has little dots over it, and that's reflecting the Midrash that says the opposite. It says, the Midrash sees Jacob and Esau as totally like at odds with one another, never to be resolved. And it says even when he kissed him, it was insincere. So he kissed him with dots,
Yes.
So that's
It's like The Godfather.
Well, like tooth marks on the page. Right?
Now, I would like to say, first of all, that I am also a twin. Not an identical twin, but a fraternal twin.
He's not the real kind.
Right, not the real kind. And I haven't had a chance to share this with you, Abby, but we're going to soon be going to Berkeley and San Francisco. And I've been setting up some meeting with some of
We
our...
are, not you and your twin.
Not you and I, we
Your
are.
mom is your twin?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And anyway, I'm setting up some meetings with some of the yeshiva supporters, and one of them, I told them we're on a book tour, and one of them said, you absolutely must tell Abby how much I appreciated her book about twins, because I am a twin, and it gave me so much insight into the relationship between twins. So there you go.
I have to say that Dov and my book tour is like another book. Because it's just sort of like, it's like traveling with Dov. It's seriously, like it's been its own chevruta. Our speaking agent is here, Susie Cohen, and she never thought, like when she signed on for this, it's not only that we eat differently, travel differently, I can leave on a Saturday and he can't, and all those things. But it's also kind of, we're going to Reform synagogues. We're going to conservative synagogues. Sometimes we're going on Shabbat. And it's just, so when he says, I haven't told you this, it's kind of amazing that sometimes we, as much as we've gotten to know each other, there are these fundamental things. And I think it was last month where he said, you know, I'm a twin. And I said, are you kidding me? I've known you for 10 years.
Exactly. I will say, this issue, though, about twins and relationships and how much is he feeling alone and that he doesn't have a family, I think that when after the dream with the ladder, he says, this is nothing but the house of God, Beit
Right.
Elokim, because and the gates to heaven. And the rabbis say he was the first one to say that God is found in a house, the house of God, that had never been said before. Abraham saw God on a mountain, Jacob spoke to God in the field. And it underscores the importance of the sense of home and the intimacy of what it means to experience God in a temple, in a synagogue, in a home type of setting. And I think it's not surprising that Jacob is the one that is searching for a home life. He's being driven from his home, separated from his twin. He's desperate for that. And he is the one that also has 12 children, or actually 13. My son was once asked when he was in third grade, how many children did Jacob have? And he said 13. And his teacher said, what are you talking about? He says, well, there was also Dinah. So
can I just say that
but I want to...
somewhere in Genesis,
Yes.
it actually refers to plural, the daughters.
Daughters, that's
of
also
Jacob.
correct. That's also correct.
So it's not just Dinah.
Right.
There are other daughters who are not named. They're not named probably
Right.
because they didn't get raped.
Right. But yes.
There are these unnamed daughters.
Exactly.
And it's astonishing to us that Jacob was so fertile. I mean, he had lots of, he
Right.
had 4 wives, but lots of kids.
And I think he wanted a home alive with children because he.
Where are you getting that? I mean, really?
That's my read. My reading. I mean, it's.
I would think you would tell me that's such a contemporary lens. I mean, that feels like there's nowhere that
I'm not. It's in. No, I'm not claiming it's any story in the text, but I'm trying to see these different narratives where he's running away. He speaks about a house of God. He's, God is telling him, "I'm with you," sending these angels. It's almost like a sense of there's a need to be with others, and then he is the one patriarch that has 12 children. Yes, it is very contemporary, but I am reading it that he's desperate for a home life. That's the way I'm reading it.
I want to build on something that you said, Abby, and that you didn't say, Dov. You challenged the narrative because it didn't feel right to you. It didn't conform to your own experience of maybe twinhood. Yeah?
Yes.
So, if I'm hearing you right, and I'm looking at my wife because this is an argument we have all the time, your own feel for the text is your source of authority then. If it feels right to you, it's okay, and if it's not, you have a problem with the text, and therefore you are the authority.
Well, that feels like a lack of humility, that I think that you're misrepresenting my lack of humility.
I don't mean lack of humility. I mean how you, as a reader,
how am I entitled?
test.
How am I entitled to have an opinion?
Because you're a smart reader.
No, but I also feel. I mean, I think that's fair, but I feel like part of the exercise of this was my really saying, is it possible that there's like lacuna here? Because very often it's like, we have Abraham sacrificing his son, and then we hear nothing from Sarah. But it's just impossible to imagine that Sarah didn't have a reaction to that. So I'm just saying that's where sometimes how I come at this is like, is there something that's left out? Because we haven't talked about Dov's red lines. I think it was very interesting that what we ran up against is that when I talk about this text, I can't talk about authors. And I'm not even talking about explaining what some people think about. Is it E and J? And I always forget the letters.
D and P.
Yeah. But so I understand that that's not a conversation we're going to have. But what he did, I don't want to say allow, what he was comfortable with was my saying, but what about? That is how, and I think part of the barrier that people have, whom I know about this text, is that it feels like if you don't know, like I can turn to Dov and say, what's the classical reading on this? I could turn that to you and you would do the same. So I feel like that's the foundation. I need to know that before I then weigh in. But I also feel like sometimes if I ask a question, it is something that he hadn't thought of because he wasn't coming at it from, I guess, a more visceral response.
Yeah, because we're schooled in a tradition, and we read through the, if you will, rosy-colored glasses of the rabbis. Now, that said, Dov and I each do have our own opinions. We just have learned to express them through the language of the rabbis. He'll pick certain texts to give his opinion. I'll pick certain texts to give my opinion. And we will both be authoritative because we've quoted the tradition. Whereas you are quoting your good common sense.
But
So,
I don't think that gives enough credit to Abby because Abby, she has profoundly researched everything,
Absolutely.
everything before we're in the conversation, and she's asking very, incisive and and really pointed questions. But deeply grounded as well, and always wanting it to be, are we getting to what is in the text? I mean, actually, there was an interesting role reversal that we just did here, because there was times in the book where Abby would say, well, here's a contemporary read that I wrote, like the story with Dina. There's the read of Anita Diamond who says that, the story with Dina, which we're
Slow
going to
down
read
there,
in this...
Dov. Anita Diamond, just explain where...
Yeah.
She, in The Red Tent, some of you remember that book. She has a read of the rape of Dina, that kind of gives Dina agency, that basically suggests it wasn't necessarily a rape, it might have been a consensual event.
Right, because one of the tragedies of that story, and that's coming up in this week's parsha, is here Dinah gets raped, and then some of her brothers, Shimon and Levi, act in their belief in her defense, and they wind up wiping out an entire city. It seems like, okay, well, they were doing it. That needs to be addressed on its own terms, but at least look, they were doing it to defend their sister. But then you realize Dinah is completely silent in the entire story. She's acted upon, whether she's being acted upon by Shechem, who rapes her, whether she's being acted upon or on behalf of her brothers, she has no agency. Right. And the power of Anita Diamond's read is she wants to say, what is Dinah's story here? And maybe Dinah's story is very different than how all the men in her life are interpreting what has been happening to her. So, and she suggests that maybe actually this was a real romance, and it was only Jacob and the sons that believed it or wanted to believe that it was a rape. So when we got to that, Abby said to me, do you think this is a legitimate read? And I said, well, I really appreciate what she's doing and why she's doing it, and it really speaks to the violence in multiple ways that's being done to Dinah, but I don't think it works within the text, because the text does say, and he raped her. He slept with her, and it says vaye'aneha, which means oppressed her, but in the sexual context means he raped her. And what was interesting is that a minute ago, when I was giving my little midrash or my little psychological read on Jacob, there was a little role reversal, and Abby said, Dov, I don't think that's in the text. So, Abby brings real profound research and anchoring in all of her questions.
He's here to defend me.
Oh, that's what Chabrusas do. So I want to move us along because
Yeah.
you already brought us there to, Jacob flees. He spends, I think, Dov, you said 22 years away.
Yeah.
And then it's time to go home. But in those 22 years, Jacob has acquired 4 wives, right? 2 wives, 2 concubines. He's acquired 12 sons and multiple daughters. We actually don't even know how many. And he's going with this encampment, and he is terrified to reunite with his brother because he knows that he has wronged Esau. So he gets there, and he divides his encampment in 2. He does, in some ways, reproduces the sins that his parents did in the 2 boys, right? They're divided up. One is given preference, one isn't given preference. He puts some in the front as cannon fodder, some in the back he's going to save. But ultimately, he brings gifts for Esau to appease him. And Esau, who comes with 400 men, so you don't know how to read it. Are these guys coming to attack Jacob? Or are they coming to greet Jacob? And Esau shows up, and there's all these gifts, and he says, I don't know how to read it, actually. He could say, I don't need your gifts. Or he could say, I don't need your gifts. I don't know whether it's soft or it's harsh. But then he says something, and in Hebrew, it's so resonant for me. He says in Hebrew, Yesh li Rav, which is, one could literally translate it, I have a rabbi. But I'm sure that's not what Esau meant. I think what Esau meant is, I've got plenty. I know you're given this stuff, and I appreciate that you have stuff now, but I actually have plenty. You don't have to appease me, and you don't have to buy me off, and you don't have to actually worry about me, because I've done pretty well. So here's my thesis, and you two can attack or defend or do whatever you want to do with it. Jacob hasn't changed a whit in 22 years. He's still the trickster. He's still the darling little boy. He still hasn't learned a lesson. And Esau, of all people, Esau has grown to be a generous, loving, hugging, giving him a kiss, not big brother, twin brother. So what do we think? Is Esau the one who's growing? And our ancestor Jacob, also known as Israel, is stymied, is stuck?
I'm not buying it. I mean, I might be influenced by, the strong rabbinic approach to always see Esau in a negative light. But my reading is that by Jacob offering this gift, if Esau accepts it, he is implicitly forgiving the offense that was done to him. And that's how I understand the tension of that whole exchange. Because once you accept the gift, you're saying we're all okay. And that's why it's so important for Jacob that Esau accept, and that's why Esau is actually not so prepared to do it. And you see afterwards, Esau says, even after he agrees to accept the gift, he says, let me leave some of my men here with you. And Jacob is, no, we're going to go too slow, you go on ahead. And I really think it's like, how much is Esau prepared to move on and to let things be and to be okay and resolve the past? And that's what Jacob wants. And anyway, that's how I read that exchange. I also would question whether Jacob has not grown. In the story with Lavan and tending to the sheep, sometimes you see him doing stuff that looks like the old Jacob, with trying to manipulate the sheep so that they'll be the right, speckled and so on, and that they'll be his and not for Lavan. And then he also
cheating his father-in-law. Is that what you're saying?
Not cheating, playing within the rules, but manipulating the system. Okay. And then other times you read that he says to Lavan that you have tricked me and changed my, our agreement 100 times. And he speaks about how he has worked tirelessly for Lavan's sheep, and Lavan does not disagree with any of this. So I think it's almost like also the story of the Jewish people, because when you are in a less powerful position, you sometimes cannot, to protect yourself, you are really put in a difficult question of how do you play within the system and still protect, your own interests, not cheat, but like if you're weaker, you don't always have the luxury, you're not on an equal playing field. And I think that's the same thing that's happening here. Esau has 400 men, he's got family and sheep. What is he going to do to try to ameliorate this situation so he can come out okay? That's how I read it.
Okay. Abby, I want to push you a little bit into a corner that I think you are not uncomfortable in, and that's the feminist corner. I want you to speak for all of women.
That's nice.
How would this story of Jacob and Esau be different if it were two sisters, two twin sisters?
I mean, I think I really don't know that answer, other than at least this text seems to see sisters as, again, fighting more than loving and seeing each other as a threat. So the fact that Rachel and Leah, at least as it's portrayed, are just entirely focused on who is going to have the children with them and whether they're going to get the guy, feels, again, to me, reductive and simplistic, and it had to be more complicated than that. I'd be interested, I know that Dov talked about, is it a midrash that actually said that when Jacob slept with Leah, do you want to tell that story, that it was actually a loving act?
That because,
Explain the facts.
Yeah, the verse says, so he's supposed to marry Rachel, but Laban, the father, gives the daughter Leah at the wedding night, and it says...
In the dark, essentially.
In the
swaps
dark,
out the women.
right? And then it says, behold, in the morning, and she was Leah, which means that they were the whole night together and he did not realize who she was. And how is that possible? So, the Midrash creates a story where Jacob was concerned that Laban would try to trick him, and they had a special signals between them, Jacob and Rachel, in order to ensure that the woman given to him was genuinely Rachel. And then when Rachel saw that Leah was about to be given to Jacob and this deception was about to take place, she didn't want her sister to be publicly embarrassed, so she shared the secret signals with her sister, and that allowed her sister to convince Jacob, in the dark at least, that she was actually Rachel.
So she basically gave Leah the hand signal.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I like that midrash. I basically just see, there's so much trickery. There's so much deception. And at one point, I think we talked in the Toldot parsha about how it seems almost like in the DNA of this family to pass on a sense of, one thing is not going to, ultimately you're going to be tricked at a certain point. And the fact that Rebecca does it, and then Jacob does it, Jacob obviously tricks his father, and then Jacob's sons are going to trick him. And Laban is tricking Jacob. I mean, and then they're tricking Laban. It was actually really disturbing when Dov said that was used by anti-Semites to prove that Jews can't be trusted. So that's part of when you asked me to ask about sort of whether it would be different for women. I just feel like there is an assumption of a fairly dark impulse that is lack of veracity and truth here that I'm wrestling with for all of these stories, and that at a certain point, what there ends up being is a lot of guilt. It strikes me that Jacob going to meet his brother, he's only scared because he knows that he did something terribly wrong. Otherwise, why would you have fear? You know that there is essentially, there's something that you're accountable for. That you haven't has been no reckoning, and this could be the reckoning. And that, again, it gives me some sense of at least there's a right and wrong here, because otherwise this deception is just getting passed along.
But I think you're absolutely right about the lack of faith that the Torah author has in this family. Yeah. That they just will cheat each other at every turn. And I think this continues not just within the family. I'm looking now at a passage in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 5, which you two write about, and it's in the portion called Naso, and it's unfortunately about I want to say this carefully, because the Torah wiggles a little bit. It's either about an insanely jealous husband who doesn't trust his wife, or a wife who actually steps out on her husband. And the Torah, I want to read it here I'm reading from the Jewish Publication Society. And if any man's wife has gone astray and broken faith with him, in that a man has had carnal relations with her, unbeknownst to her husband, and she keeps secret the fact that she has defiled herself without being forced, and there's no witness against her. But a fit of jealousy comes over the husband, and he's wrought up about the wife who has defiled herself. And then the next clause says, or if a fit of jealousy comes over him, and he's wrought up about his wife, even though she has not defiled herself. So, either way, this husband can subject the wife to a trial by ordeal. He basically makes her drink poison, and if her belly explodes, well, she was guilty.
Not poison, just muddy water.
Muddy water. And if she was innocent, well, surprise, surprise, she gets pregnant, they have a baby, and they live happily ever after.
Right.
So let's hear the women's point of view and then the man's point of view.
Well, I will just say this gets at a kind of fundamental divide or realization I had talking to Dov over all these months or years. And we should explain that the podcast was just 10 minutes per parsha, and the book is only 5 to 6 pages per parsha. And we did that as a discipline intentionally. We can talk about why. But one of the things that was really a revelation to me is that Dov had to ultimately reconcile every story as positive in some way. Like, this is a document that has to be good. And sometimes I would find that he would be what I called pretzeling himself to get to the good outcome or the good moral of the story. This is one of the prime examples, the Sota ritual. And I think it wasn't like I'm just stamping my feminist foot and saying, this feels so wrong. You know, I'm aware this was written in a different, not written, created, passed on in a different time, in a different context. But it just felt like with every other part of the Torah, I can see my way to a moral kind of kernel, or sort of a hidden sort of gem of a lesson, even if it wasn't so evident in the pshat kind of thing. And here, I just couldn't get there, and it felt like there were so many machinations to try. It just, the fact that this woman, that a wife who is simply suspected without proof and often erroneously is accused of this, and then has to come before these men who basically, I think they also tousle her hair, which, and make her drink this ink, and write all these curses. Sorry?
They shame her.
They shame her. It's degrading, and it's intentionally so. And now I'll let Dov defend it.
Right. Well, I don't think that the question here is a man's point of view or a woman's point of view or a feminist or non-feminist point of view. I think anybody that's approaching this passage with a ethical sensibility is going to be, really deeply bothered about how is the Torah creating this type of a ritual. I think that in most Orthodox circles, and certainly among Orthodox rabbis, they're not prepared to even ask that question, because to bring that sensibility and say, wait a minute, this text seems horrific in terms of what it is saying, because what if you then don't have an answer to that question? I think that one of the things that I feel even before Abby and I started in our chavruta is that I would ask those questions to myself and to the text. But as Abby said, because I believe in the text as being from God and being bound by it, I don't think every character has to be good. I don't think, the four fathers, four mothers are human and they're flawed and all of that. But I think that the mitzvot in the Torah that come from God and how God acts in the Torah, if we believe that God is good, which I do, then, you have to understand how could this be good? And that's the questions that I asked myself.
So can a good God still give bad law?
Well, okay, so when I approach a text like this, a strategy that I use, I'll call it a strategy, an interpretive strategy, I draw on what Maimonides writes in the Guide to the Perplexed. And he's dealing with the case of sacrifices, but it'd be easier to illustrate this if we talk about slavery. What Maimonides says is the Torah was given for all time, but it was also given to a particular people at a particular time. And that people are not always ready to hear or to live by or to be commanded by the ultimate right way and the ultimate good, and that the Torah has to point them in the right direction. So if you think about the case of slavery, I think it's impossible to read the Torah and not think that the Torah thinks that the institution of slavery is horrific and that it wants us to see an end to slavery. And there are all these mitzvot. You free your slave after 7 years. If a master kills his slave, he could be put to death. That was completely revolutionary, and this was 3,500 years ago. But the Torah never says don't have slaves. It never eradicates slavery. And why is that? Because it took us in the Western world 3,000 years from the time the Torah was given. We've only gotten rid of slavery 150 years ago. So if the Torah had said, free all your slaves, don't have slaves, nobody would have listened. We wouldn't have had any progress. So it has to put us on a path of progress. So applying that here, so a good God can give less than fully good law, because God is giving law to human beings to where they are right now. So I try to apply that strategy here and to say that in a patriarchal society, under some cases where a husband based on suspicion could just have his wife summarily executed, the Torah here maybe is not ready to completely abnegate his patriarchal authority, but it wants to mitigate it. So it creates this ritual which actually she is going to pass. It's the opposite of the witch trials. In a witch trial, how are you proven to be innocent? Because you would drown and die. Here, if nothing happens, she's innocent. Only if there's divine intervention and some miracle happens to make her stomach distend is she proven guilty. So you create this test that she's definitely going to pass, and the husband, gets to have his suspicions laid at rest, and they get to go home happy. That at least was my attempt at explaining this, to which Abby said.
So, Rabbi
What did you say, Abby? Abby basically said, I'm so glad that he's happy, and which basically she said, look, you think that you've made this, work this out in your mind, And I am telling you, you are still pretzeling yourself, and it is still a horrific text, even with all of that explanation. And I think that was really an excellent part of this chavruta, where sometimes, where like I think I've resolved it, and then I step outside of myself, where Abby gives me that other perspective and makes me realize, no, I have not.
And in
really.
fairness, there are plenty of times where it went the other way, and he pushed me on something where I just couldn't get there.
So I want to get a hypothetical. You are a Rosh HaYeshiva. Your students are all men. One of your students comes to you and says, Rabbi Linzer, I want to talk to you in private. Mm-hmm. And he says, I'm pretty sure my wife's having an affair.
Oh, my God.
And I don't know what to do because I'm worried she might get pregnant and maybe the baby won't be mine. And I'm asking you, Rabbi, would you perform the ritual of sota?
Well, thank God the answer is absolutely not, because we do not have all of the requirements. We don't have a temple, and we don't have all of the rabbis, as they will often do, create many, many hoops that you need to jump through particularly when it comes to these problematic sort of rituals or mitzvot that make it mostly, obsolete and moot.
So you just brush them off?
Look, that's a much more of a pastoral conversation, but what I will say is that the rabbis actually were extremely creative in finding ways to keep husband and wife together, even when there was presumptive evidence of adultery. And they had ways of interpreting it away, and I think that's sort of in the spirit here of how do we, if the couple wants to stay together, how do we work to keep them together?
I'm very sympathetic. Here at JTS, many years ago now, I had a student who came to me and said, I had actually helped perform her wedding. And she said, my husband's really jealous. And he gets jealous over like everything. If he sees me talking to another man, he goes berserk. So I said, well, what do you mean he goes berserk? And she said in a very quiet voice, he hurts me.
Oy. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know what to do. I was a kid, like, oh my God, what do you mean? She said, he tortures me. He physically abuses me. So I waited a week. I came back to her. I said, are things better? She said, no. I said, the Torah has a commandment. It's divorce. Mm-hmm. That is a positive commandment in the Torah when appropriate. Would you consider it? And she said, I would, but I'm so frightened of him, I can't tell him that. Yeah. And I got some of my colleagues together, and we literally moved her out of that house of pain. Right. She's now happily remarried, has kids. It's a story with a wonderful ending. But, we confront this. Dov confronts it. I confront it. I don't know the extent to which you have to do that just as an author, that people come and spill their guts to you.
When I was synagogue president.
Yes, although that was usually why they couldn't pay their dues, right?
But why they weren't happy with their seats.
But I do want to say that this idea of what it's called, the term is shalom bayit, domestic peace. Sometimes I'd like to believe in the story in the Torah, and I'd like to believe in, as I told you before, sometimes when there's seeming evidence of adultery, that if we're talking about a case where the couple wants to stay together and can have a healthy relationship, and the question is, how can the rabbi help them do so? But we do have to acknowledge that this idea of shalom bayit, keep the couple together, actually sometimes has been used to trap women in horrific marriages. And the scourge of aguna nowadays, women who should have a get, but the husbands are not giving it. And in Israel, where the rabbinate has the power to coerce the husband to give a get, often so many cases, they will not use that power in the name of shalom bayit, right, of domestic peace. So that idea can be misused to do tremendous harm to the woman.
Thank you for that.
Good, and a huge yasher koach for you and for your colleagues that stepped in and protected this woman.
I mean, with fear and trembling.
Yeah.
So first, I want to say there's two more parts to this program. But before we get to those two parts, this conversation has been really frank, open, illuminating. You can see why they were such a wonderful chavruta. And I will tell you, it translates onto the page brilliantly. And you're going to have fun, you'll have fear, you'll have trembling. You will learn week in, week out. This should be your companion every Shabbat as you read the portion. The next two parts are what I'd like to call the lightning round, which is there's a mic here. Anybody who wants to can come up, and you have the chance to ask a question. Please say who you're asking, whether it's Abby or Dov, not me, Abby or Dov, and they will do their best to give an answer. And then when that is done, and you are satisfied you've heard your answers, Abby and Dov will be signing the books. You can buy them, of course, at discounts for $20.
For Hanukkah.
Yes, great Hanukkah gifts for everybody you know. So please, if you have a question, now is your time to come up. Maybe that gentleman in the first row there would like to
Or maybe
ask
the
a
mic could
question.
go to people.
Oh, thank you.
I get to ask her questions all the time. So this is, in each of the parshas, you picked one piece of it and you focused on it. You said because you limited amount of time. Would you go back through it and pick another piece of each one and kind of go at it again? Is there like limitless amounts of editions of this book?
So It Takes Two to Torah 2.
Exactly. Exactly.
The sequel.
I have to say, Dov came up with the title of this book. He gets a lot of credit for that.
I mean, I think that in every time that we prepared for the podcast, we had a couple of really rich possibilities, and we chose one of them. I think that the Torah is an endless source of engagement and inspiration and, learning. And I could easily see, I'm trying to convince Abby that our next book should be that we look at passages in the Talmud. So it would be It Takes Two to Talmud. But certainly I think we could do it a second time. What do you think, Abby?
You'll do that right after you go through the whole Talmud with her, right?
Just breeze right through it. But the thing I would say, like even today, because we didn't know exactly what Bert was going to ask us, but he did say that he was going to maybe focus on the parshiot from last week and the one coming up. And so I was just taking a look and at the actual Torah, and I said, my God, we didn't talk about the ladder, which is what we talked about today. And I said to Dov, like when we had a call today, why didn't we focus on the ladder? We ended up, somewhere else. But I think that's the richness of it, is that, and particularly, we haven't even talked about post-October 7th. I feel like this entire book changes after the history we're living through, and that's part of, I think, for someone who doesn't study and talk about it every day, what I have seen is that sort of a line or a word, or even after losing my dad, it suddenly has just a completely different resonance in a particular moment. Thank you, Dave.
Hi, I have a question for both of you. It strikes me that this is such a bridge building exercise. We were talking, when you were introducing, you were talking about an interfaith center and you were talking about bridge building. We all often live in our own worlds, our own bubbles, right? And this is such an interesting way to push out of this bubble. So I'm curious, aside from the depth of the text, which is beautiful, I'm curious about the bridge building. What are you learning, and what do you want to tell us, those of us who care about bridge building, about could we replicate this, or what, right? I'm so curious about kind of the learning at the meta level about building bridges across our amazing Jewish community.
Is that
Thank
Cheryl?
you.
Yes.
Cheryl Cook? Head of Avodah, everyone. Incredible organization. I'm so honored you're here.
So thank you. That's such a wonderful question. And, you're so right. My whole life, I would learn with chavruta. And you think that the chavruta model is one where you're allowing yourself to be challenged, you're finding a greater truth. But when the chavruta started with Abby, I realized, all of my previous chavrutas shared like 99.9% of my worldview and my commitments. So I was still very much in my silo, and the types of questions that would be allowed or raised would be from a very narrow range. So the way in which this sort of has opened us up, opened me up certainly, has been enormous. And I would say one of the things, I think the learning process about what allows this to happen, I'll say two things. One in terms of the book, and the podcast, and the other in terms of the book tour we've been on, which has also been so much about, for me at least, I've been in more conservative and reform synagogues in the last 2 months than I've been in the 58 years of my life prior, so combined. So that has definitely been a lot of bridge building and connecting. I would say one of the things that made this work, we alluded to this before, is that, we were very respectful of one another's sensibilities, or I would say Abby was very respectful of my sensibilities. I would be for Abby, but I was the one who had more obvious sensibilities. So, Abby would sometimes say, well, the authors of this text, human or divine, or whoever wrote this, and that's fine. But if she would have said other things that would have really made it uncomfortable and pushed my buttons, I wouldn't have been able to have been in the conversation. So if she would have said like, well, this obviously, Iron Age document, what else do you expect it to say? Or, if she started quoting JPE&D, the documentary hypothesis, again, I respect that scholarship. I can have that conversation, but I couldn't be in a deep, ongoing Torah, chavruta, if I felt I was always sort of being made uncomfortable, or I was feeling uncomfortable. I'll give another example. At one point, Abby sort of said, like, okay, we're dealing with the 10 Commandments, and the question we want to ask are these the right 10 Commandments? And and I said, I would rather ask the question, are these the commandments I would have chosen? So Abby said, Dov, that's very solipsistic. It's not all about you. And I said, no, that wasn't my point, Abby. My point was, I'm not going to stand in judgment of the text. I'm not going to say these are or are not the right commandments. I can talk about my reaction. So I think that knowing where those areas were of respect and sensibility allowed us then to bring, the fullness of ourselves and to really, challenge one another in a deeply meaningful way. I'll pause there. I want to hear from Abby, but then I want to say something about the book tour that we've been on and how important that's been.
Well, I'll just say very quickly, because I also want to go to other questions, but I appreciate it, Cheryl, because one of the things that's been so surprising wherever we go is that people are affected by the fact that we did this at all in a much bigger way than I expected. And it's been meaningful for the people who are very deep into the Jewish world, who often see that we've managed to subdivide and splinter ourselves as a tiny people. We've managed to judge each other and decide whether we're Jewish enough or Zionist enough, and all of the things that are splintering us right now. And here are two people who pray very differently, think very differently, were raised very differently. Just again, it sounds like a Hallmark card, but the text is our common ground, and there's real friendship in it. And it doesn't mean that we're changing each other. We were interviewed by Brad Artson from AJU last week, and he said, "Don't worry, it's not contagious. It's not like this idea that we're going to become what each other are." And I think what you've seen, what we've all seen, and whether it's American politics or what's just within the Jewish world, is just such I think, almost a laziness about division, about just letting these divides kind of get cemented. And that's just, I guess, a longer answer than I expected to give. But it's really been affecting how people are feeling it's a refreshing breath of fresh air.
I'll maybe just say one last thing, which is, even though the subtitle is Orthodox Rabbi Reform Journalist, we don't approach this as I'm representing orthodoxy or Abby is representing reform. We're being ourselves. We have our different backgrounds, our different beliefs and commitments, but ultimately we're being ourselves. I'll say things that are not common for an Orthodox rabbi. She'll say things maybe not common for a Reform Jew. But ultimately we're just Dov and Abby talking. And I think sometimes the it's hard to be in conversation when you feel that you have to represent something. And that is what, oh my God, I'm an Orthodox rabbi. How is this going to come across? What am I saying about Orthodoxy? What am I saying about, your denomination? So I think there's something very human here that makes it possible.
And then, David, there's one in the back as well.
Yeah, earlier I heard Abby just kind of under your breath mention that the authorship is a conversation we're not going to have, and then Dov came out, I mean this is JTS, so I think I can push you on this a little bit. I guess authorship is not something that you said you feel comfortable with, and I guess if I can ask you, what is the source of that discomfort if you're having a frank conversation? I have to tell you that a lot of the questions that you raised, like about Dina, whether it was a rape or whether it was a love story, those are different sources. I mean, it's right there in the text, and the Lavan and the Yaakov stories, in one of them, Yaakov is the trickster. In the other one, Hashem, makes it in a dream so that Hashem is the one who tricks Lavan, and it's not Yaakov. And there's so much richness to a source-critical approach. I think if you're going to have a frank conversation, why would it be uncomfortable for you to at least approach the issue of source criticism, maybe even leaving aside the issue of authorship, because it's possible that, many sources were created by one author, maybe God. I think that's a very big stretch, but I think you can still use modern scholarship in order to inform your conversation and your chavruta. And I'm wondering, Dov, if you would address, why would you feel that would be an uncomfortable place to go?
I have read a lot of biblical scholarship. I appreciate all of these. Once you're sensitized to it, you see these things. You can see these things yourself, like you can appreciate some of these things. I have no problem. First of all, we could sit over a Shabbos lunch or go out for coffee and talk about this issue, and I have no problem talking about, having a conversation around biblical criticism and so on. But it's not my comfort zone. When I engage the text, I want to be looking, I believe it to be from God, and I want to be feeling that I am engaging this and seeing this as a text that is from God, that is not a composite, that is, and that allows, because I'm not doing this academically or intellectually. My approach is a religious one, so I can switch into the academic ear, but that gets me out of my religious zone, and that's the form of engagement I want with the text. So we can, if you want to say, I actually think we can see two different ways of stories here that are merged together, that's fine, and that can be part of the conversation. But if it gets to a certain point where I'm feeling I can't be in my religious zone anymore, then again, not like I can't have the conversation, but that's not the ongoing chavrut I want to be having learning the Torah.
Thank you for that straightforward answer. I think there was a hand way in the
but
back.
I'm going to call it short because of the time.
Okay.
There are always more questions, but there aren't always more hours before people's bedtime.
All right.
So
we will be selling books right here. You can line up and with your $20 bills. I hope you guys have pens.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Really,
Thank you.
and thank you, Bert, for conducting this, everybody. Thank you. Have a good night.